After much explanation and reassurance, the merchant party finally relaxed. Yet unexpectedly, Sanlong suddenly laughed. I think they're being way too humble. Those merchants aren't simply as they say they are. No one understood what he meant and looked at him in confusion. Don't at least half of the travelers go missing when trekking through Banyue Pass? To cross this land while knowing that rumor, surely you're all extraordinarily brave. Nothing ordinary about you. That's not true at all, young man, the elder responded. Besides the fact that rumors are largely exaggerated, there are many caravans that have passed through without harm before. Oh, Sanlong said. As long as you find the right guide, go around Banyue territory, all is well. So we sought out and found a local to lead us, the elder said. Yeah, that youth Tiansheng said. It all depends on the guide. We owe everything to Ashalga. If not for him, we wouldn't have been able to avoid all those quicksand pits. When the sandstorm started, he knew exactly where to bring us to hide. Otherwise, we would have been buried alive in sand by now. Shilian took a glance. This Ashao, who guided them, looked rather young, seemingly in his 20s, with an attractive, stony face. When he was praised by the other two, he didn't make a show of it. His head was down and he mumbled, It's nothing. Just doing my duty. Hopefully when the wind dies down, none of the camels or cargo will be damaged. They'll be fine for sure. The merchants were all very optimistic, but Shilian had a feeling things weren't as simple as they all thought. If all the trouble could be avoided by simply not crossing into Banyue territory, then did all the former travelers who lost their lives die because they didn't believe the rumors? Shilian gave it some thought and said to Nanfeng and Fuyao in a quiet voice, This is too sudden. Once this storm passes, we'll need to make sure these people pass through safely before going to the Banyue ruins. Then Shilian looked back down to continue deciphering the Banyue writing on the stone stele. He recognized the word general earlier, but that was because it was a common word. It had been 200 years since he last visited the kingdom of Banyue. Even if he was fluent then, it had all been forgotten since. Shouldering the burden of translation really required time and patience. Just then, Sanlong said, Tomb of the General. Shilian remembered now. The last character was the one for tomb, grave, burial, and other similar terms. He turned to look at him, amazed. Sanlong, do you know the Banyue script too? Sanlong smiled. Not much. I only know a few words because they're interesting. Shilian was already used to him saying that. The word tomb was not often used. If Sanlong really only knew not much, how could he just happen to know exactly what this one character meant? His not much probably meant the same as ask away, and Shilian grinned immediately. Excellent. Maybe the characters you recognize happen to be the ones I don't. Come closer, let's examine this together. Shilian waved lightly to beckon, so Sanlong went over. Nanfeng and Fuyao stood next to them, lighting the tomb with their palm torches for them to read. Shilian touched the words with his fingers, reviewing the writing in a low voice with Sanlong softly reading the words. The more they read, the more amazed they looked, before gradually growing glummer. The merchant boy, Tiansheng, was young, and youths were prone to curiosity. After the little chat earlier, it was as if they had become familiar, so he called out, Guga, what does it say on the stele? Shilian snapped out of it and replied, This stone stele is a memorial. It tells the story of the life of a general. A Banyue general? Tiansheng asked. No, a Central Plains general, Sanlong answered. A Central Plains general? Nanfeng was puzzled. Why would the people of Banyue build a memorial for a Central Plains man? I thought the two nations were constantly at war with each other. This general was special, Sanlong replied. Although the memorial calls him a general, he was actually no more than a captain. Was he promoted to general later? No. At the beginning he led a troop of hundreds, but it dwindled to a troop of 70, then to 50. In other words, continued demotion. The feeling of being demoted to the point of nothing was quite familiar to Shilian, and he could feel eyes on him. He pretended not to notice and continued to decipher the Banyue writing. Tiansheng couldn't understand and continued asking, What kind of official gets demoted lower and lower in rank? As long as he doesn't make any major mistakes, there should only be delays in promotion, not demotion, right? How much of a failure do you have to be? Shilian clenched his right hand in a fist and raised it to his lips. He faintly cleared his throat and replied in a stern voice, Young man, receiving continuous demotions is not as rare as you think. Huh? Sanlong chuckled. It's true. It happens a lot. He paused before continuing. This captain got demoted time and time again, not because he was incapable or incompetent. It's because despite poor relations on both sides of this conflict, instead of winning battles on the battlefield, he kept getting in the way. What do you mean, kept getting in the way? Nanfeng asked. He prevented enemies from killing civilians of the Central Plains, and he also blocked his own army from killing the people of Banyue. Every time he did this, he got demoted a rank. Sanlung spoke lightheartedly, and the 7 or 8 merchants sat closer to him like it was story time. Soon they got into it and started commentating. I don't think the captain did anything wrong, Tiansheng remarked. It shouldn't be a problem to let soldiers kill each other, but not civilians, right? He's too blindly kind for a soldier, but overall he didn't commit any crimes. Yeah, he was saving lives, not killing people. Shilian smiled at all the comments. These merchants before them had never lived a day in a battle-torn border. They were not the same people as those here 200 years ago. The kingdom of Banyue had long since perished. It was easy for them to say this, criticize that, even give compliments. But the actions of that captain weren't so easily forgiven back then, not with a simple remark like he's too blindly kind. Within the group, only Ashao understood better, probably because he was a local. Now is now. 200 years ago is 200 years ago. To only receive demotions was a blessing for this captain. Fu Yao, however, clicked his tongue. How laughable. Shilian could pretty much guess what he was about to say and rubbed his forehead. Sure enough, the light of the flickering flames illuminated Fu Yao's glum look. One must do the duty demanded by their position. If he became a soldier, then he must always remember to defend his country and kill enemies on the front lines. Casualties are inevitable in war. Such soft-heartedness has no place in war and will only drag down his fellow soldiers. His enemies will also think him foolish. No one will thank him in the end. Fu Yao's words had irrefutable logic, and silence filled the cave. He continued dryly, "People like that only have one end: death. They will either die in battle or at the hands of their own people." After being struck speechless for a moment, Shilian broke the silence. "Yeah, you're right. He did die." Tiansheng was shocked. How did he die? Was he really killed by his own people?" After a moment of deliberation, Shilian still replied in the end. "Not really. Here it says there was once a battle when both sides clashed, and they fought. This man's bootlaces came loose, and he stepped on them, tripped, then... Everyone in the cave had assumed the death must have been tragic but heroic, so they were all taken aback at first, thinking what kind of death was that? Then laughter exploded. He was trampled by the soldiers on both sides who were blinded by murderous rage and was cut down by a mess of random weapons. Is it that funny? Sanlong quirked a brow. Shilian also piped up. Yeah, it's rather tragic. Let's be more sympathetic and not laugh, okay? We are in his tomb, after all. Let's give him some face. I don't mean anything malicious by laughing, Tiansheng immediately claimed, but his death is just so... There was nothing Shilian could do. Reading the epitaph to this point, even he wanted to laugh. He didn't comment and continued to translate. In any case, even though this captain didn't have a good reputation in the army, some of the border citizens of both Banyue and Yong'an were grateful for his efforts, so they called him General. They built this simple tomb for him and erected a stone stele to remember him by. Later, the people of Banyue discovered another miraculous thing about this memorial. As long as one kowtows before the stone stele 3 times, one can transform all disasters met in the Gobi to good fortune. Sanlong completed the translation. He spoke so enigmatically that it was very convincing. His expression was also serious, so when the group heard, several of them immediately started prostrating, muttering that they'd rather believe it true than not. Shilian, however, was confused. What? Is that written here? Is it really that magical? Sanlong smiled softly and said in a lowered voice, No, I made that up. But since they laughed earlier, their prostrating now should make up for it. Shilian looked back at the stone stele and saw that it was indeed the end of the epitaph, and there were no more words. He had been feeling a bit woeful, but now he thought it funny. He whispered back, Why are you so mischievous? Sanlong stuck out his tongue, and the two chuckled. Just then, someone shrieked, What's this? The shriek echoed in the cave, sharply reverberating against the walls, and it caused all their hairs to stand up. Shilian instantly turned toward where the shriek came from and demanded, What happened? Where the merchants were once prostrating, everyone had jumped up in a flash and scurried away in fear and alarm. Snake! Nanfeng and Fu Yao moved their palms toward the commotion and lit up the ground in that direction. Curled on the sandy floor was a slender, brilliantly colored snake. Why is there a snake? The crowd was growing increasingly anxious. How did the snake not make any noise? We didn't hear it when it slithered up. When the flames appeared near the snake, it instantly became alert and raised itself into an attack position. Nanfeng was about to torch it when someone leisurely strolled over. That person easily snatched the snake with his left hand, clutching it at its heart. He brought it closer to observe and said, "Isn't it normal to see snakes in the desert?" Someone that fearlessly gutsy was, of course, Sanlang. They say to fight a snake, seize it at the heart. If pressed here hard enough, no matter how venomous its fangs, it'll be helpless. The snake wrapped its long tail around Sanlang's left arm meekly. At closer range, Shilian could see clearly. The snake had translucent skin, and its vivid red insides were visible and mixed with threads of black, resembling organs. Rather disgusting. The tail was the color of flesh and segmented with layers of hard shell, unlike that of a snake. More like a scorpion. Seeing this, Shilian's face changed and he called out, "Watch out for its tail!" Before Shilian finished speaking, the long snake body wrapped around Sanlang's left arm suddenly let go. The tail snapped backward and tried to stab viciously towards Sanlang. Venomous as the tail was, Sanlang's right hand was faster, and he easily caught it. Now holding both head and tail, Sanlang showed off the snake to Shilian like it was an interesting toy, laughing, "This tail is pretty interesting." On the end of the tail there was a long, flesh-red needle. Shilian sighed in relief. "I'm glad you weren't stung. As I thought, this is a scorpion snake." Nanfeng and Fu Yao approached to observe the snake too. "Scorpion snake?" "That's right," Shilian said. "It's a kind of venomous vermin found only in Banyue. They're very rare. I've never seen one before, but I've heard of them. Body of a snake, tail of a scorpion. Its venom has the strength of both combined. And if bitten or stung..." Shilian trailed off. He watched Sanlang twisting the snake, pulling and squeezing as if it were a towel, stopping just short of tying it into a bow. Shilian was speechless for a moment, then gently chided, "Sanlang, stop playing with the poor thing. It's dangerous." Sanlang laughed. "Don't worry, Gaga. It's nothing. The scorpion snake is the totem of the Banyue State Preceptor. Gotta take this rare chance to examine it." Shilian blinked. "The totem of the Banyue State Preceptor?" "That's right," Sanlang said. "Apparently it was because the State Preceptor could control these scorpion snakes that the people of Banyue believed in her infinite powers and worshipped her." Hearing the word control alarmed Shilian. When it came to controlling anything, whatever it might be, they usually came in huge numbers. He immediately cried, "Everyone leave this cave! There may be more than one scorpion snake." Before he could finish, there came a wail. "Ah! Snake!" Other voices started yelling. "So many snakes! Over here, too!" From the shadows, 7 or 8 scorpion snakes soundlessly slithered into the cave. They came so swiftly and quietly from unknown crevices, but they didn't attack, only watched, judging. Soundless in both movement and attack, not even hissing. Truly extremely dangerous. Nanfeng and Fu Yao released 2 fireballs and shot them toward the snakes, and a large ball of fire exploded inside the cave. "Get out!" Shilian yelled. No need to be told twice, and everyone ran outside. Luckily, it was still light out, and the twister had long passed. The wind calmed. The group of them escaped into open ground and kept running. As they ran, someone said, "That stone memorial is too scary. How come after we kowtowed 3 times and we still ran into stuff like that?" Shilian was thankful that they didn't know that those last words were fabricated by Sanlang. But then he heard someone else say, "Yeah, it was pretty much the same effect as worshipping the scrap immortal. The more you pray, the unluckier you become." Even when the issue was barely related to him, he still got shot. Shilian was speechless. Suddenly, Tiansheng yelped in alarm. "Uncle Sheng!" The elder he had been assisting collapsed. Shilian darted over. Illustration number 2 of the chapter. What happened? Pain filled the face of Old Man Sheng, and he raised a shaky hand. Shilian grabbed hold of his hand and frowned, his heart sinking. There was a growing, angry swelling spreading rapidly down his palm, when within the red and purple bruising there were 2 small punctures, barely visible. A wound that tiny would not have otherwise been noticed until it was too late. Everyone, check and see if you have any wounds on your bodies, Shilian called out immediately. If you do, use a rope to stop the spread. Shilian turned the hand over to examine the meridians and saw that the red and purple swelling was visibly climbing up the veins of the arm. What a formidable venom, Shilian thought. He was just about to unravel Roya when next to him, Ashao ripped a strip of fabric from his own clothing and promptly knotted it tightly around the old man's bicep to prevent the venom from progressing. Shilian mentally praised him and looked up without needing him to say anything. Nanfeng had already taken out a medicine bottle and popped out a pill. Shilian helped the man swallow it. Uncle, are you okay? Tiansheng cried. Ashao ge, Uncle won't die, will he? Ashao shook his head. To be bitten by the scorpion snake means certain death within 4 hours. Tiansheng was shaken. Then, what do we do? Old Man Sheng was the leader of the caravan, and the other merchants also started panicking. Our friend here just gave him a pill, right? That wasn't an antidote, Nanfeng said. It's for temporary longevity. The most it can give him is 24 hours. The crowd became even more distressed. Only 24 hours? Does that mean we can only sit here and wait for death to come? Is there no saving him from this venom? Right then, Sanlang walked over slowly. There is a way. Everyone turned to stare at him. Tiansheng turned his head joyously. Xiaoge, if there's a way, why didn't you say so? Give me a fright. However, Ashao stayed silent and shook his head. Of course it's not easy for him to say, Sanlang said. How could he possibly tell you that the bitten can only be saved at the cost of everyone else's lives? Sanlang, what do you mean? Shilian asked. Gaga, do you know the story behind the scorpion snake? Sanlang asked. In the legends many hundreds of years ago, there was once a king of Banyue who, while hunting, inadvertently caught 2 spirits born from 2 venomous creatures, 1 snake and 1 scorpion. The 2 venom spirits cultivated deep within the mountains, ignorant of the world and causing no afflictions. Nevertheless, the king considered their nature and believed they would cause evil sooner or later, so he decided to execute them. They begged and begged for their lives to be spared, but the king was cruel. He forced the 2 creatures to mate in front of him and his ministers to serve as entertainment at one of his many banquets, and after the feast they were executed. Only the queen pitied the 2 creatures, but she feared going against the will of the king, so all she could do was pick up a leaf off of the fragrant fern and cast it out to cover their corpses. The snake and scorpion became vengeful spirits, immensely resentful, and they cursed the descendants born from their mating to forever remain in the kingdom of Banyue to destroy its people. Ever since then, scorpion snakes were found only within Banyue territory. Should anyone be bitten or stung, the venom would spread through their bodies like wildfire, and they would die a miserable death. However, thanks to that one act of kindness by the queen, the fern leaves used to cover their corpses became the antidote for their venom. That plant is called Shenye, and it only grows within the borders of Banyue, Sanlang finished. Is the legend true? Can it be believed? The merchants asked anxiously. Buddy, this confirms life and death. Don't joke around with us. Sanlang smiled but said nothing, refusing to speak more after telling Shilian the tale. Tiansheng turned to Ashao. Shaoge, what is that red-clad Guga said true? After a moment of hesitation, Ashao replied, Whether the legend is true, I don't know. But the Shanyue plant does grow within the walls of Banyue, and it is indeed the antidote for the scorpion snake venom. Meaning the only way to live after getting bitten is to venture into the kingdom of Banyue, Shilian said. No wonder so many caravans passed through Banyue territory despite knowing the deadly rumors. It wasn't that they were defiant and stubbornly went to seek their own deaths, but rather that if they didn't go, they would most certainly die. The scorpion snake was the totem of the evil master of Banyue, and she also controlled them. The appearance of these snakes was no mere coincidence. With only a few heavenly officials like them here, there was no way they could ensure the absolute safety of the entire merchant group. And there was no telling how many more snakes would show. Shilian raised his 2 fingers and pressed them against his temple, trying to connect with the heavenly communication array to see if he could shamelessly borrow more junior officials. No dice. He couldn't connect to the array. Couldn't reach out at all. Shilian lowered his hand and wondered, I didn't use up all my spiritual powers, did I? I calculated this morning and there was still a little bit left. He turned to Nanfeng and Fuyao. Can either of you try to enter the communication array? I'm getting no connection. After a moment, the other 2 also looked grim. I can't get in either, Nanfeng said. There were cases where the connection would become fuzzy near highly evil auras potent enough to diminish the powers of various heavenly officials, and sometimes cut them off completely. It seemed that was the situation they were in now. Shilian paced back and forth and wondered out loud, it might be because we're too close to the kingdom of Banyue, so the communication array is blocked. Just then, in the corner of his eye, there was a flash of red. Nanfeng and Fu Yao were busy trying to reconnect with the communication array, and everyone else was occupied checking for wounds on their bodies. The boy, Tiansheng, was anxiously holding tightly onto Old Man Sheng and didn't notice a wine-red scorpion snake soundlessly climbing up his spine, curling near the neck, and opening its mouth. However, the fangs were not aiming at Tiansheng's neck, but at Sanlang's arm right next to it. The snake leaned back, then pounced. In the speed of a second, before the snake had the chance to sink its fangs into Sanlang, Shilian's hand shot out and snatched it right at the heart with blinding precision. Given his strength, Shilian could crush the snake's heart if he wanted to, rupture its innards, and spill its insides. But not knowing whether the snake's flesh was also poisonous, he didn't dare to press harder. Shilian raised his other hand to grab for the tail, but the snake was slippery and artful, making it difficult to catch. Shilian squeezed, but he only felt something soft and cold slither away from his fingers. The next moment, a sharp needle pain flared from the back of his hand. The scorpion tail. After the sting, Shilian snatched the tail and captured the snake properly, then squeezed down hard until it fell unconscious. Even having been stung, Shilian's face never changed, and he tossed the unconscious snake onto the ground indifferently. Everyone be careful. There may be more snakes around. He felt a tight grip on his wrist before he finished, and looked to see that it was Sanlang who caught hold of him. Sanlang? Shilian was slightly taken aback. The reason he sounded confused was because, at that moment, the expression on the youth's face was off. It was unexplainable, frosty, almost to the point of being frightening. His eyes were focused intently on the tiny wounds on the back of Shilian's hand. The wounds themselves were originally the size of needle punctures, but the venom was vicious. The back of his hand had immediately swelled up angrily, with a large patch of purpley red, and those small puncture wounds had visibly enlarged to the size of knife cuts. With a dark expression, Sanlang wordlessly snatched Roya from Shilian's arm and immediately knotted it firmly on his wrist, preventing the venom from advancing. While Roya enjoyed snuggling up to Shilian, it wasn't normally that well behaved, and yet, in Sanlang's hands, it was so compliant it was like it was dead. For all the time they'd known each other, Shilian had never seen Sanlang look like this. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sanlang turned to pull a dagger off the waist of one of the merchants. Nanfeng saw and knew instantly what Sanlang was about to do. He ignited a palm torch. Without sparing a look, Sanlang burned the tip of the dagger to disinfect it, before turning back to Shilian and drawing a cross over the puncture wounds. Just as he was about to lower his head onto the hand, Shilian hurriedly said, "It's okay. The venom is aggressive. Sucking it won't do much. I don't want you to get poisoned." Sanlang ignored Shilian's protests, tightened his hold on Shilian's hand, and placed his lips upon it. Shilian felt his own arm tremble slightly, and he couldn't explain why. Next to him, Fu Yao said in disdain, "I can't believe you went and got yourself stung. What were you doing, catching the snake when the kid might not have even been bitten? You're just causing unnecessary trouble." That was true. Now Shilian thought back to the airy way Sanlang played with the snake in the cave. He probably wouldn't have even cared about an attack, and would have easily avoided being bitten. But just in case Sanlang didn't notice the snake in time, then wouldn't it be too late for regrets? Shilian waved his good hand. "Don't worry, it's not like it hurts, and I won't die from it." You're really not in pain?" Fu Yao asked. "Really, I don't feel pain anymore," Shilian answered honestly. His words were true. Shilian was someone who possessed the worst of luck, so when he ventured deep into the mountain, 8 times out of 10 he would step on vipers or run into venomous insects and get bitten, stung, jabbed, or poisoned in thousands of ways. However, he'd always been very stubborn at not dying, and most he'd run a fever. After 3 days and 3 nights of fever, he'd wake up, bright as rain, and continue on as if nothing had happened. He simply wasn't sensitive to pain, so as much as it hurt, he could live with it. We have this image now. Right after he said this, Sanlang finally looked up. The red swelling on the back of Shilian's hand had gone down, and Sanlang's lips were stained with blood. His eyes were extremely cold, and he moved his glare to the unconscious snake on the ground. There was a loud boom, and the snake abruptly exploded into a purplish-red pool of blood and flesh. The sudden blast surprised everyone, but no one knew who did it. Even if the blood didn't splatter onto anyone, there was still a feeling of unease blanketing the crowd. Tiansheng remembered that Shilian had also been stung, asked worriedly, "Gaga, you got stung too. What will you do?" Shilian felt the bandage on his wrist and smiled. "Don't worry, little one. We'll stick with the plan of going to the Banyue ruins and searching for the Shenyue ferns." Another merchant said, "You guys are going? What about us? Should we send someone to go with you?" "You can all stay here. Banyue territory is dangerous. The more people there, the more mishaps can happen. We'll find the fern and bring it back to you within 24 hours, Shilian said. Will you really? Thank you so much. How can we possibly ever?" A number of the merchants started stuttering their thanks, but then their faces changed when Shilian continued to speak. "In order to reach Banyue as soon as possible, I want to borrow your guide temporarily, if that's all right." Naturally, Shilian meant Ashao. The merchants went from grateful and relieved to largely hesitant. Shilian knew where they were coming from. They were afraid that Shilian might run off with their guide once he found the Shenyue fern, or even if Ashao didn't run away, he would still be greatly delayed. Nonetheless, none of them wanted to venture into that wicked place where at least half go missing, so it was a huge dilemma. Their worries were perfectly normal, so Shilian quickly added, "And just in case anything else comes to attack you, Fuya, will you stay until we return?" With one man staying, the merchants finally agreed and nodded. "All right, as long as Ashao is willing to go with you." Shilian turned to Ashao. "Are you open to lending us a hand, my friend? If not, that's okay too." Ashao nodded and said, "Yes, but the Banyue ruins are actually not hard to get to. You just keep going in this direction and you'll reach them." After bidding the merchants farewell, Ashao took the lead with Shilian, Sanlong, and Nanfeng following right behind. A while later, Shilian inquired, "Ashao, do the scorpion snakes appear frequently in this area?" "Not frequently. This was my first time seeing them too," Ashao replied. Shilian nodded and had no more questions. Truthfully, he did live in the Banyue area for a number of years, and this was also his first time seeing a scorpion snake. Ashao's answer was not surprising. Nanfeng realized Shilian's intentions and asked in a low voice, "You're suspicious of this, Ashao?" Shilian responded in a whisper, "Either way, we've brought him out. Just keep an eye on him." In the past, it was usually Sanlong who would talk to him first. Shilian wasn't sure if it was because of the incident earlier, but the youth still looked rather upset, walking without speaking a word. Shilian couldn't figure out what was going on and didn't know how to talk to him, so he kept on walking as well. The four continued to trek through the vast Gobi Desert for close to an hour. The windstorm had long since passed, and without any obstructions, they advanced quickly. Soon they could see ragged weeds here and there, growing in cracks in the rocks and sand. By the time the sun was setting, Shilian finally spotted an ancient walled city on the horizon. The city was difficult to see because it was the color of sand, camouflaged by the yellow so it became one with the desert. Some parts of the city walls were caved in and buried in the sand. As they approached, they found the walls were extremely high, towering over 30 meters. It wasn't hard to imagine the city's past magnificence, how grand it must have been. Passing through the Barbican, the four formally entered the kingdom of Banyue. Past the gates was a wide and empty city street, with dilapidated houses on each side and wrought-in beams and broken bricks strewn about. Perhaps out of habit, Ashao cautioned the others, "Please be careful. Don't leave the group on your own." The other three didn't need that reminder. The actual Banyue city was far different from what they'd imagined. Nanfeng wondered, "This is the capital of Banyue. This is the kingdom of Banyue. It's smaller than a capital." "A desert country is only as big as the oasis it's built on," Shilian explained. "At its peak, the population was only about 10,000. It was actually pretty lively in a small city like this." Nanfeng continued to observe the surroundings. "It would probably only take a few days to siege a country of this size." Shilian shook his head. "Not necessarily. Don't underestimate the people of Banyue, Nanfeng. Even if their population wasn't more than 10,000, they kept the number of soldiers at an average of 4,000. There were more men than women. Aside from the sick and old, the farmers, most men joined the army. Besides, the majority of those soldiers were over 3 meters tall, each more violent than the next. With maces in hand, they would keep fighting, even with swords through their chests. They were very hard to fight." Ashao seemed rather surprised and glanced at Shilian. "This young master seems to know a lot." Shilian maintained his smile and was about to converse some more when Nanfeng posed a question. "What's that wall?" He was indicating a giant yellow earthen building in the far distance. Building wasn't quite the right word to describe it. It was a giant enclosure formed by 4 massive mud-colored walls with neither doors nor a roof. Each wall was over 30 meters, and on the very top there was a pole with something tattered attached, flying in the wind. It was a chilling image. Shilian turned his head and glanced, then said simply, "That's the Sinner's Pit." By the sound of the name alone, it was obvious it wasn't anything good. "Sinner's Pit?" Nanfeng frowned. Humming gravely, Shilian explained, You can think of it as a jail. It was made specifically for imprisoning criminals." "How does it imprison criminals if there isn't even a door? Throw them in from the top," Nanfeng wondered. Shilian was hesitating to answer when Sanlang suddenly spoke up. "They do get thrown in, and the pit is full of venomous snakes and starving beasts." Shilian was relieved to finally hear him speak again, but when he looked over to Sanlang, the boy met his gaze and turned away. Nanfeng swore. "That's no fucking jail, that's torture! How cruel! The people of Banyue were either sick in the head or savage psychos." Shilian rubbed his forehead. Not all of them were like that. Some were quite endearing. He paused suddenly, and his brows furrowing. "Wait." The other 3 stopped, and Shilian pointed upward. "Look at that pole above the pit. Is that a person hanging from it?" In the dimming light of the setting sun, and at such a distance, it was difficult to see what exactly was hanging from the pole. But getting closer and scrutinizing the shape, it became obvious that it was a scrawny little person in black, their clothes unkempt, dangling in the wind like a rag doll. "It's a person," Sanlang confirmed. When Ashao saw the hanging person, his face paled. This was such a bizarre, anguishing display that even a calm individual like him couldn't bear the sight of it. Just then Sanlang tilted his head and said in a low voice, "Someone's here." He wasn't the only one who noticed. Shilian also heard feather-light footsteps approaching. The 4 immediately moved to hide in the many decaying houses on the roadside. Shilian and Sanlang entered one house, and Nanfeng and Ashao hid in the one across the street. Soon after, at the end of the broken street, the female cultivator in white appeared.